intervention in Syria, before or after the election, US-led intervention in Syria, yes or no? Will it ever happen? Should it happen?
Events like intervention in a conflict of that sort depend on an incident occurring that causes a kind of immediate consensus in the international community that something must be done. That has almost happened already, but it hasn't quite reached that point, and therefore I tend to doubt, unless there is some unfathomable almost action that occurs, I don't see it happening. You've got to give me a chance to say one sentence to Congressman Wexler.
I'm not sure how long is one sentence in diplomatic language.
I don't want to really be debating you because I'm not a member of your political system and you're not a member of my political system. So we're sort of offside. But I do want to say this. Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, appeared on 60 Minutes in December 2011 and was asked point blank, when is Iran going to cross the nuclear threshold? It's not a classified document, it's an interview on 60 Minutes, the biggest news show in America. And his answer was, a year from now. So a year from now, from that 60 Minutes show, is December 2012. And my only comment to you is that the period of engagement, as much as you feel it has led to the conditions of an international coalition today, has put off these very important sanctions to 5 minutes before midnight. And it would have been much better had those sanctions come in at 11 o'clock.
Ambassador.
Syria, neither a President Obama nor a President Romney would directly militarily intervene in Syria because we have been exhausted from 2 wars in the region and because our direct intervention would probably be unwelcome by the opposition as branding them as pro-American and pro-Israel. But if the situation, as I suspect it will, continues to deteriorate, as slaughters continue to accelerate, what I think will happen in this administration and in a next administration will be there will be more indirect support for Turkey, for the Gulf states, to create a safe haven, humanitarian zones, and support for arms for the opposition.
Professor Haas.
It's always a mistake to equate the word intervention with military intervention. There's a lot more we can and should be doing to help the situation in Syria. We could, for example, do much more work with the opposition to get them to espouse a political agenda that would attract current support, to work with the opposition to attract current political supporters of the regime to peel away. We should make clear that by a date certain, and that should be very soon, war crimes indictments will be brought against specified individuals unless they move away from the regime. We should do things like cut off all flights from civilian flights from Syria to Europe. We should have sanctions against Syria that are no less draconian. There's the sorts of sanctions about to be introduced against Iran. All the Arab states should break diplomatic relations with Russia for its support of Syria. What I'm trying to say is there is a long agenda of things that can and should be done before we contemplate direct military intervention.
Mr. Wexler.
I would agree both with Mr. Haas and Ambassador Eisenstadt. I think they're both correct, and you combine the two, you have yourself a full policy of maximum incentive that will hopefully result in the removal of Bashar Assad as president of Syria with as few lives lost as possible. I do think, though, there is one point that must be made, which obviously I think all the gentlemen recognize, and that is it's not simply just arming or intervening with the opposition. and hoping that the opposition articulates a political platform that is somewhat acceptable. The problem is part of, and we don't yet know whether it's a minority or too great a percentage, part of the opposition in Syria could in fact be related to Al-Qaeda or other forces that are vehemently anti-American, vehemently anti-Israel, and this is a fact of life that we need to engage. 30 seconds, if I may, just to respond to my friend Ambassador Gold. I agree. Sanctions on Iran should have been implemented 7 years ago, 8 years ago. The problem is, when President Obama took office, there wasn't near the consensus in the world. We already had sanctions, America. There wasn't near the consensus in the world in order to effectively implement them. And the fact is, in order to engage Europe, in order to engage China, the Indians, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and everybody else involved here, and to get the Saudis to up their production, it takes time.
Egypt, if it all comes down to a decision to support a democratic transition to a Muslim Brotherhood candidate, or to support the military in trying not to transfer power to the Muslim Brotherhood, what should the U.S. and what would the U.S. will do?
I think you have to respect the Egyptian political system, which contains both civilian and military elements. I read in the Los Angeles Times 2 days ago a story in which a Defense Department spokesman was saying that Egypt, the Egyptian army still retains the power to declare war, and saying that should be transferred quickly to the civilian leadership. It seems to me that if the Muslim Brotherhood still on its websites condones jihad and war against Israel, to see that power move from the military to a civilian leadership that hasn't proven that it has shaken off its ideological origins is a little dangerous.
The administration faces a terrible dilemma, not unlike the one they faced a little over a year ago with Mubarak, who had been a staunch ally of the U.S. and a very constructive force for stability in the Middle East with Israel, with the Tahrir Square demonstrations. Because here we have, on the one hand, the United States, which is the proponent of democracy, supporting empowerment, having a Muslim parliament elected in what is as free and fair an election as we've had in the Arab world. On the other hand, the military, which has been the dominant interlocutor for both Israel and the United States, taking the opposite position. Senator Leahy, the Democratic chairman of the very powerful Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee, has already demanded that the State Department and Defense cut off funding for the Army. I think that would be a mistake of the first order. We need to let the Egyptians work this out. And if we start throwing missives over the transom, I think it would be a mistake and it would alienate all sides. This is a terribly difficult issue for the United States, and if we seem to line up behind one force or the other, I think we'd be making a mistake. We need to let the Egyptians work this out while we quietly say to the Army, the rule of law is important, democracy is important. If you're going to take this step, which you've already done, you have to figure out a way in which you reconstitute the election and do so quickly. But I think, again, that has to be done very quietly, and this is not the time for histrionics.
Look, right now we've got a situation in Egypt where there's no president, no parliament, and no constitution. So it's hard to imagine a worse situation. I would simply say that U.S. support for anyone ought to be conditional. If it turns out that the Army refuses to cede power to civilians, then any U.S. support of the Army ought to be highly conditional on a democratic transition. If it turns out that the Muslim Brotherhood does end up ruling Egypt, at least or controlling the presidency, then any U.S. support of Egypt say, Mr. Morsi in that position, ought to be highly conditional on everything from how Egypt treats minorities to how it deals with the Israeli-Egyptian treaty, and above all, what kind of constitution and parliament you have. If it turns out that Mr. Shafiq is prime minister, again, our policies ought to be conditional on certain types of behaviors and a commitment to real political reform. But the day of the era in which the United States treated Egypt essentially unconditionally, I think needs to come to an end. And we have to understand, not just with Egypt, but many other countries that were traditional allies, for example, Pakistan, what we've got to do is have much more pragmatic, much more transactional, much more conditional relationships where all forms of American support become closely tied to specified behaviors.
Again, I would agree. I would agree with Mr. Haas and Ambassador Eisenstadt.
We don't agree.
Well, if you put the two together, again, I think you have the right mix. Where I would respectfully differ with Mr. Haas, America always needs to support free and democratic elections. No ifs, no ands, no buts. President Bush very eloquently made that case regarding Egypt specifically in his State of the Union addresses. President Obama has implemented it. However, if America were to create a list for each country that we support with those specific demands, as specific as how you treat your minorities, it'll become a very complicated foreign policy, and I suspect that we will find ourselves in a very difficult spot in terms of why here but not there, and what's just here and why isn't it just there. I think we would be more prudent to identify a small number of the most critical aspects of American interests and stick with that in terms of the preconditions or the conditions that are then tied, but we need to use a broader range or area of our influence. Today, mostly we talk about our bilateral relationship. Egypt is, if I understand it, about to get a loan from the International Monetary Fund, which they desperately need. America is still the biggest donor to the International Monetary Fund. We ought to use our influence in a broader fashion with the IMF and other international institutions. But in order to do so, if we have a list of 15 or 20 criteria, we'll start applying that around the world, and it becomes a very complicated and I suspect somewhat hypocritical process.
Thank you. I have a list of 10 other questions I wanted to ask, but I'll give the crowd, we are already past our time, and if I want to be invited to moderate any panel next year, I'll give the crowd the chance to ask 2 or 3 very quick questions. No comments, please, just quick questions, and then we will conclude. But I can't see anyone, so is there a microphone somewhere? No microphones? Okay, over there. Okay, please. I can't hear 2 questions at the same time. The lady here is now asking a question.
I know that Dory Cole said that the policy changed by President Obama from prevention to containment. The question is being around Wexler, because I understand how that's true. If the liberations are happening now with Iran, the U.S. is allowing them to keep the uranium stockpile at 20%. But that is much easier to go to 85%. It seems to me that that seems like more of a containment than prevention. They could hide it. It's easy to hide away. And
Where's the question?
the question is it really containment still, not prevention, because they're allowing them to stockpile at 20%, and they have to learn expertise on execution so they don't crash. It's easy to go to 20%.
Dory, 30.
How does that change from, how is that prevention and not containment?
I think the concern was that the P5+1 are going to cut a deal on the 20% because that can go to weapons grade much more easily and leave the much larger stock of the 3.5%. That's been the general concern in Israel and in many other quarters. But right now, there's no deal. There's nothing happening. So I don't think you can characterize the administration's position on containment or prevention on the basis of its proposals with the P5+1 in Moscow.
10 seconds, Bob.
President Obama specifically and clearly rejected a policy of containment regarding Iran's quest for nuclear weapons in both of his speeches in November. He could not be clearer.
And with this, we'll conclude. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the panel.